On. Here we go. Hello, welcome to the Wargamer. I'm your host, Rob. Welcome to Stream Street Day 182, or as we... Huge numbers, or as we know it, 169 plus 13. That's the
Nice.
Nice. I'm joined by, look at this gorgeous man who has joined us, JP. Hey, bud, how are you?
Yeah, doing good, man. Doing good. Glad to be here.
Oh, I'm very glad to have you here. I'm very excited what you've got to talk to us about today, which is Listbot V2, or as Listbot meets Skynet. I'm not really sure where we are at this stage. I'm kind of getting scared of Listbot, but I think we're meant to be scared. Is that why you've invented it?
Yeah. I mean, eventually, I'm hoping that I don't have to do anything, and I just hook it automatically up to Twitter, and it just tells us how to play the game.
Perfect. If you could also make it some sort of like AI-based like conversationalist on Twitter, that would be perfect. Because that's never gone wrong, not one time.
No.
Right, so, hello everyone though, welcome to the show. I want to say a big thank you to people that have subscribed, like W. Soren all the way from Texas, Malik, big love to you for 4 months. Thanks for being here and subscribing. I want you all to know that you've got your emotes in the chat, and if you did happen to join the T Sports Network Twitch as well, there's a whole bunch of emotes coming out there, which is fun. So you guys should get some hot new emotes for that. I want to say thank you to everyone else on Patreon, and of course to my Hydro homies on the podcast, the guys that drink nothing but quality H2O, the podcast bros. Crazy Horse, what up? Faces and Bases. So JP, before we get into talking about Listbot, how have you been? I know you've been playing some 40k. There's loads been going on since, was it 100 days ago maybe we had you on? It's been a while.
In the early days of the stream streak, very impressed that you're still going. Great service. Again, people need, I think, when you're locked down and you can't play the game as much, people want like just more content. So
we got it.
Thanks. Played some 40k. That was good fun. I'd sort of always wanted to play Slanesh. I love the models. I love the keepers, and just didn't really feel like it in AOS, partially because I was like, I don't want to get loads of stuff to summon. And so just busted out a bunch of Exalted Greater Demons in 40k, ran them down the middle of the table, and came second at an event and got sort of a theoretical best painted. There wasn't a real best painted prize, but the TO assured me that it went to
40k.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they were like, play with great plastic, we don't care, as long as it has guns. So that was good fun. How have
you found the 40k experience? Obviously, as an Age of Sigmar player moving over to that, do you feel like they play similar enough?
Yeah, it's similar. I think it makes me appreciate a couple things about AOS. Like, I like the fact that in AOS, especially if you're a new, because I was a new player, like in AOS, almost all the rules are like on the war scroll and quite simple. And I know in cases that can lead to WhatsApp group confusions about how exactly rules work, but I do like that it's simple and straightforward. And I don't know if this is controversial or not, but it definitely made me appreciate the priority roll more in Age of Sigmar, because
as being a positive mechanic.
Yeah. Because when I went, I felt like when I went first in 40k, it was so freeing to never have to fear the double turn. I was like, the worst case scenario is that he kills all this stuff that he can kill, and then I get to go again. Like, no matter what, I get to go again in each, like, I'm going first in each of these turns. And it, like, I mean, I'm not claiming to be a 40k expert good player at all, but it was like, okay, it felt like I had much more freedom to do whatever I want and not worry about being punished for it, because there was no chance of a double turn. Whereas in Age of Sigmar, you've often got to be like, okay, yeah, I can screen this objective off with 10 Brimstone Horrors technically, because there's no way he can get through them and get onto the objective. But if there's a double turn, it's like, well, if he does win priority, these will be dead, and he'll just be on the objective or into my bubble of heroes or something like that. So I know nobody enjoys getting double turned, and I think there's stuff that you can maybe do to make losing priority less of a big deal. But I think it made me appreciate the mechanic existing.
I think that's a really good conversation. I accidentally kicked off a conversation yesterday on Twitter about the priority roll, which is not what I intended. My question was, I feel like Kharadron Overlords really like you go, I go, like the priority roll just ending up being like a flat line. Because when they get the double, it feels terrible for your opponent, but when they get a priority roll that goes against them, they're in a really tough spot. Generally. That's how I envision. Well, that's how I've seen that army play, and that's how I feel it plays best. But I agree with you. I also feel like something we don't ever appreciate when we're playing Age of Sigmar is really we're playing, I don't know what the actual maths is. Is it like 64 games? Because obviously you've got the first turn, whoever decides to go first, but then you've got the priority roll that splits it up into two. And then each one of those splits out. So you really are like going down to, I found 40k very binary a lot of the time. Again, like you, not the best 40k player in the world, very much so. But especially the last edition. I'm very excited to play this edition anyway, because I feel like Age of Sigmar teaches you to really analyze what could happen. Because it's there's this plus this. But maybe there's a different mindset in 40k where you're thinking 4 turns ahead because you know it's you go, I go. And there's a skill set there as well, which we don't appreciate, I guess, maybe.
I think part of it might be like that you get... I think they talk about this difference in chess versus Othello or Go, the little black and white stones game, is that in Age of Sigmar, because the tree of the game tree, as you say, expands so wide, you are sometimes going to have to play more by feel and less by analytics. Whereas in 40k, you've got a lot of things are more reliable, and the turn order is one of them. And so you can play a much more you can be like, I've thought out this whole 3-turn game plan, and if I pull it up, if I do my mechanics correctly, I can pull it off. Whereas in Age of Sigmar, you're sometimes going to have to just be like, the game looks completely different to anything I could have predicted 2 turns ago.
Absolutely. Yeah, that I think that's the beauty of it. And so when I see the conversation happen about the priority roll, as it often does once every 6 months, or it comes around.
Yeah.
But I what I'm very excited about, and because it happened on Facebook yesterday, on some of the T-Sports coverage, someone was like, I love all of the stuff that you've done, but why would you play such a stupid game with the priority roll? And I'm like, well, I think you'll find that most players consistently perform well, and they do it with the priority roll in existence. So if anything, because there's a good conversation about 40k, about is it like the skill, the power level of the army that really pushes the players over the top, and not the skill level. A lot of what we're about to talk about in a moment is the skill level, but the guys from 40k Stat Center at last year's, or maybe this year's LVO, worked out that the top 100 people in the ITC rankings, let's say, had, when they weren't playing each other, something like a 90% win rate. When they were playing I don't mean to be rude, the chuds of the field. I'm just using some shorthand. I also am one of the 40k chuds. So
straight
I'm
to jail.
Yeah. I'm in the 40k jail with everyone else. I just want to know that I'm the worst performing 40k member of the 40k show. So there's no dramas there. But yeah, it doesn't affect the win rate, mainly for players at the top end. I think is something that we'll be tracking more in the future. I don't think you've tracked that yet.
No. I think also just to sort of top on that, so I think it was Goonhammer we're looking at going first is I think it has like a 70% win rate or something.
It was like 57.
Well, but it was in, I was gonna say, in game 5, where you're the players are the most closely matched, the win rate goes up nearly to 70%.
Okay.
Either way, it sort of, that's not my main point. It was more just that, like, if you imagine that there's some win rate associated with going first in 40k, and if you imagine that win rate would be the same in Age of Sigmar, it's brought down by the fact that you probably didn't win all 5 priority rolls. So if we said it's a 57% win rate for going first, you can see that in Age of Sigmar that's going to be brought down by the fact that even if you're more likely to win by winning the priority rolls, you probably didn't win all 5. So you're maybe getting 80% of that 57% win rate if you won 4, for example.
Yeah, okay, I see exactly what you're saying. Yeah. Really good point to think about as well. And then also Pete in the chat, who I know over Exploding Dice in Northern Ireland, who's been running lots of 40k events.
Oh, yeah.
He said that he's finding, we had a really good chat about terrain last night, so we're setting up some terrain for the 40k Super Series. So big love to you, Pete. Going first on win rate depended heavily on terrain. That's the other issue that I think that you do have in 40k specifically, in that there is some huge terrain variance between different tournaments. And very much what I'm happy about we did with the Super Series is that we ended up with
a lot of terrain.
A lot of terrain, but and there were some core changes to that terrain as well, like which will affect stuff. Did you happen to catch any of the coverage? Any thoughts?
I've sort of skipped back and forth through the games, and so you have a lot of impassable terrain.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's that stuff is cool and it adds to the game a lot. And I
Eh,
think as one of the things, like following on Pete's point for 40K going first is, so if you go first and you can get an advantage, then because you go first in turns 2, 3, 4, and 5 as well, you're going to snowball that advantage every turn. If you set up the terrain in a way that you can't get that snowball started on turn 1, suddenly it's whoever can create the best gap to start the snowball is going to keep that snowball going through the other turns, and that makes it sort of a skill-based game in the early turns to get the advantage. So rather than just the dice roll deciding who gets initiative, as it were.
yeah,
So I think that's
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. It's fascinating, right? Because I think the thing that you're very interested in, and I think you've done an excellent job of when we start talking about Listbot now, is you've really identified that, and it's the thing that I've talked about for a long time. You can be skillful at the game.
Yes.
Like, there's a whole bunch of people who think that that's not the case, but you can be, and it's more than just skill on the tabletop. Yes, it's also list design. Yes,
Yep.
it's also army selection. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. So it's table based and it's workload done before the table based job. But they're all skills. That's what I like.
Yep.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So talk to me about Listbot. Give me a top-down view on what Listbot was before when we last talked to you, for new people who haven't heard about it.
Sure. So Listbot is basically sort of a collective term for a bunch of sort of statistical analysis and machine learning things that I do on like gameplay in Age of Sigmar. I'd say that sort of there's a rough divide in sort of the meta-analysis of like how players do in the game, so like player performance and faction performance in the game, and then the other part of Listbot, which is looking at like war scrolls and units and stuff separate from the players that are using them. And so previously I did a lot of Listbot analysis based on, so essentially the big change that I've been looking at recently is previously I used tournament ladder results. So you just be like, okay, this player came first, this player came 10th, et cetera, to determine, rankings for factions and players, which I think is the most obvious way, and that's where the most data is. So that's good, but it misses out obviously on the key element of like, well, who played who, so you're like, okay, this guy came 10th and this guy came 3rd, but sometimes they both went, 4-1 or 3-2, depending on the size of the event. And, the difference was like, okay, someone scored more secondaries, or someone didn't paint their army and stuff like that. So what I've done recently is I've used any database I can get my hands on, a lot of stuff from tabletop.to, of where I can see exactly who's played who, and constructed a data set from that. And so there's a system called the ELO system, which is used in chess, which is basically just some math to help you create ratings for based on head-to-head matchups. So everybody can start at 2K rating, and if you beat someone, your rating will go up. If you lose, your rating goes down, and it accounts for something like, if a 2,700 rated player beats an 1,800 rated player, their rating doesn't change very much. And if they lose to an 1,800 player, it might drop quite a bit. So it accounts basically just for like the differences in who you played. And so I applied that to the factions and players in Age of Sigmar. And so that gives you an interesting view of the factions, of where you say, okay, well, maybe one army is always winning its first 3 games on day 1, but then loses its 2 harder games on day 2. And how do you compare that to an army that's always winning game 5 or something like that?
Traditionally known as gatekeeping armies, right? Like armies that people have to get past in order to go further.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so I think a lot of the stuff that I'm looking at stats, as you point out, is like stuff that everybody's always known about. I'm not coming out and saying like anything insane, but it's just sort of looking at the actual numbers for phenomena that people are used to observing at events.
Okay. All right. So let's start talking about some of the data sets. What have you ended up finding out, I think, effectively, or like what can we go through and learn?
Yeah. So I think, the first thing is just because I think Wargamers, we like to just have like, okay, give me the list, give me the factions and like what they look like, who's good and who's not, basically. Not a huge amount of surprises there. Like you sort of saw in the beginning of this year, you saw Zinch at the top, and then after the GHB, you saw KO at the top, and I think a lot of this stuff is always important to remember that there's going to be fluctuations. It's going to depend on who's playing what and stuff like that.
I think actually we should break that down a little bit more,
sure.
because a lot of the people listening, not a lot of the people, sometimes they don't pay as much attention maybe as you or I to exactly what that looks like. So effectively, Tzeentch did very well at the very beginning of the year. Were there other factions that you saw do well or thought did well?
Yeah. So you still saw like two just classics. You saw like the Daughters of Cain and Ideneth Deepkin just keeping up and doing super well as well. Not particularly distinguishable from Tzeentch. And then you get just underneath them, sort of technically, if you want to say A tier instead of S tier. Again, it's a spectrum. It's not necessarily super useful, but yeah, Ossiarch Bone Reapers and Fire Slayers and more tribes keeping up with them, and then also Slaanesh are up there. Even though they hadn't had their points changes yet, but they'd taken some hits, so they were up there. And then we also saw a bunch of armies sitting in the middle. KO were sitting in the middle of the pack. Cities, Slaves to Darkness, Nurgle, Beasts of Chaos were actually sitting in the middle of the pack. And then at the bottom we had Sylvaneth and Nighthaunt, which again I think have been struggling for a while. I think Nighthaunt actually there's sort of another phenomenon to touch on is Nighthaunt can probably get sort of their book could do better, but there's a phenomenon that happens that if you are a weaker faction, so if you're not one of the top 5 factions, you're probably not going to be played by players looking to win the whole event. If you're like, I want to make a list that's going to win the event I'm going to this weekend, you probably won't pick Nighthaunt. So what that means is you get a divide in the players where someone's like, I'm going to play Nighthaunt because I love the models, and I know the faction's not that strong, so I'm not going to bother putting together the best
list.
Win rate. Yeah, exactly. They're like, I'm not going to try and put together the highest possible, the most powerful possible Nighthaunt list, because even if I do, it won't be as good as the most powerful list of X. So I'm just going to, because I want to play the models, I'm just going to play whatever I want, and I'm going to go and I'm going to have a good time. And there are still players out there, individuals who are still going, 4-1 with Nighthaunt. And so that exists. But it's just like overall as a faction, you're just competitive players. If they're not picking it up, then people are just not as worried about optimizing their lists, and so it's sort of like they're going to fall even further behind in a similar way to the top factions will be boosted ahead slightly. One of the things I'm going to look at, and I looked at I think about a year ago, is another tier list for basically the same ratings for factions but adjusted to by the elo of players who are playing them. So you basically, I imagine what you'll see is a similar looking tier list, but squished together slightly closer, with less of a gap between the top and the bottom.
So effectively, the more in quote bunny ears skillful players, if you will, generally tend to pick up the more overpowered books.
Yeah.
So there's a good argument there for the reduction of skill. And the uptick in power level being like but obviously that's in list choice and list design.
Yeah.
You're right. Someone might be as skillful as, let's say, the person who consistently wins. Someone goes 5-0 consistently, but someone always goes 3-2. But they always play the low tier book. They might have the same skill level, but they've just chosen different power level books. So there's book power level, and then of course there's player skill, which are they're really difficult to pass out from each other.
And also there's list. The list power level as well, sort of in between the book. Like it's sort of a mishmash of both, right? Because there is player skill in building a list, but obviously there's also a lot of community lists going around. So there's the book, the list, and the player.
Yeah. So just to catch up with the chat, Zreg said, I did my honours thesis on machine learning algorithms. I wish I had the idea to do something like this rather than the boring subject I covered. Tibbles, this is JP. I'll include his Twitter in the chat so you guys can go and find him. Tibbles is now your new stalker. Congratulations.
Love
JP.
it.
Love it. Yeah. and everyone's surprised. A question from Korzak. Hey, Rob, I'm struggling with goblins. They have some really OP strategies with magic attacks. I'm not really sure how to answer that, bud.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Gobapalooza are Listbot's most undercosted unit in the whole game. So
Okay,
yeah,
I'll tell Nathan that, but he might he might just keep throwing Skink Star Priest at me until I run away. So and thankfully they're not that sharp as a model. So going into the new GHB, what factions did we see be at the top?
Yeah, so we saw Caradron Overlords and Seraphon. So this is basically from July to now. There aren't as many events as there would be, obviously, if we weren't in a global pandemic. So, but yeah, Caradron Overlords and Seraphon are the top two. You still see Fire Slayers and Iden at Deepkin in roughly the same place they were before, like hanging around just under the very top. The armies I think that you see saw the biggest change in is you see Stormcast Eternals gets bumped up a lot. And again, this also ties into the same thing we were saying before, which is that so Stormcast Eternals gets a buff, it's hard to analyze how much the buff is having the effect or how much it's just players who are like, oh, I'm going to pick up my Stormcast army again because they've been buffed. I think like an interesting thing you see is like the Celestin Prime has gone down. Did he go down 20 points?
320, 340. I think he went down 40 points, but let's say
so
20.
So we went down, not an insignificant amount of points, but not a huge amount of points. And people are putting him now in more lists, obviously. And it's like I see lists where he could have fit before, and now he's also there. And it's like, people are just more willing to try out this unit. Obviously being cheaper is better, even if you're not necessarily, maybe you're getting a Triumph or an Endless Spell or something. But like the effect of something being buffed means people want to try it. And I think that's especially true in Age of Sigmar, where you tend to rotate your armies sort of regardless of how you're doing with them. From looking at the data, people tend to play the same faction for 2 to 3 events and then swap regardless of what like their win rate was. And so if you're looking to swap and you're like, well, Stormcast Eternals have gotten a series of buffs, more people pick it up, more people build competitive lists with them, and you're going to see them sort of rise up in the ladder like that. So Stormcast went up. Tzeentch went down a fair bit, sort of dropped more to the middle of the pack. It took Tzeentch had a fair few
point changes,
changes and rules changes. And I know a bunch of people after Tzeentch first came out and it was so strong and had like a lot of like non-interactive games. Then people sort of self-comped. I know I did. I played a lot some games with Tzeentch that sort of ended on turn 1 basically because of no retreat stuff. And then I was like, okay, well, I don't really like, and I was sort of confident that it was going to get changed. And I was like, okay, I'm just not going to play it for whatever my next event is. And so people moved away from it and it had some changes, but it's still, it's definitely not a weak faction. It's still sitting there as a solid faction.
I think it's still a very solid faction. I think very much like Skaven, it's broken out into, there's a whole bunch of fun mechanics you can produce out of it. Like, because I do think that there is, and I've talked about this before when me and LLV did the stats, there are armies that you pilot and there are armies that you play, and those powerful books oftentimes are armies that you just pilot. They just do the thing, you do the other thing, you win the game. And then when they move into the can you play category, which you can play with the really powerful books as well, but it's a nice distinction. I think that they become fun, and I think Tzeentch is one as well there, where they've moved into that you can play, and then because sometimes why wouldn't you is the real question. Like you ask yourself, like the question between Marauders and Warriors, you always ask yourself, why wouldn't you take Marauders, and then you go, I'll add a Chariot, but why wouldn't you add more Marauders? I'll take and it's hard to not just always do the
agreed.
So please continue. Sorry.
I was just going to agree with what you're saying. I think that often what you see in the difference between those tippity top lists and just the top list is those S tier armies are just it's harder to punish them for their mistakes, or they have certain win conditions which are just you can win on turn 1. And that was sort of the case with the Host Duplicitous no retreat list. Is it wouldn't always work, and it didn't work against all factions on all battle plans, but there were games where you could rock up and be like, I'm going to take this turn 1 because just of the missions. Like, just because of what the mission is and what the army does, I can win this turn 1. And if you have a handful of games like that, it's just going to push you to that next level. And then, as you say, you get changes and you go into these armies that you can play where you're like, I still have very powerful moves and effects, but I don't have really those situations where you're just like, okay, it's over, or I've made a terrible mistake and still won because I just had this get out of jail free card.
Yeah, like, because I actually think that those sometimes promote bad play. Like when you have to be cagey, like when I was playing with my Chaos Dwarves, I had to learn how to move far better. And then when I have anything that's like movement 14 or 16, I'm like, this is like crack. I'm like, I'm like in a whole different world. It like be given a superpower, which is just unbelievable. So yeah, it completely changes up, and I think that helps develop skill sets. One of the questions that Korzak is having in the chat is how much Warhammer do you have to play to develop a skill set? It's a great question. I obviously wrote the workbook you can go and find on the AOS Wargamer website, but it's some anecdotal information for you. I would stick with an army, and maybe even the same army list for a couple of dozens of games, and then start changing. But I wouldn't change army then. And then I would continue on till you really understood it, and then try and find an army that plays completely different way. Like the difference between Kharadron Overlords and how they play versus Slaves to Darkness and how they play are uniquely different. And those are two kind of like, maybe there's some sort of guide I could do. I wouldn't. I'll do that later. But there you go. There's some sort of off the cuff advice. Okay, what else do we pick up from Listbot? What else is Listbot teaching us today?
So then just recently, just today, I was looking at just more skill expression stuff like we've been talking about, and I've been looking at the fact that again looking at now that we've got these head-to-head matchups, I sort of broke the game down into how often is the better player winning and how often is sort of the worst player winning. In Age of Sigmar, and also taking the factions into account. And what I found is about 30% of the time you're getting the better player with the better faction winning the game, but also an equal amount of time, 30% of the time you're getting a better player with the worst faction winning. And then it's a similar 50-50 split that 10% of the time the worst player is winning with a better faction, 10% of the time the worst player is winning with a worse faction. And also didn't include in that data set, but the better player was only bringing a higher ranked faction about 55% of the time. 55% of games had sort of the sort of higher skill player playing a better faction than the lower skill player, which I thought was interesting. And now again, that doesn't show you the list, right? So if someone's bringing Tzeentch and they're bringing all mortals, they're all mortal list, all chaos warriors. That sort of shows up as the same stronger faction as if that person was bringing Change Host. So it doesn't account for that. But yeah, it's basically just that that sort of phenomenon, which obviously will exist, doesn't exist as much maybe as we thought. And also when the gap was big enough, when the gap got to about 15% in sort of the elo between players, the higher rated player, sort of tying into what you were saying before, was winning 90% of their games.
Wow. Wow, that's significant. That's a significant gap.
So once,
go on, after you.
No, I was just about to say the same thing again. Good thing you cut me off.
Oh no. So I do know one of the things, because I think everything you've done is absolutely phenomenal, and there's still more to talk about. One of the things that I picked up from Pete when me and Pete were talking about the 40k stats is data sets. Like we look at some of the Goonhammer articles, which again are excellent. So there's no criticisms meant here. It's just a kind of clarity, because in the Goonhammer article, when they were looking at that win rate on going first, it was a fairly small data set. But when so Pete's talked about the fundamental swings, because he probably more than anyone has put the most data sets together for any Warhammer. LLV obviously did excellent for Age of Sigmar, but 40k is just a bigger game and it had more events. And he said that over the course of adding 300 games into the data set, it just violently swung some of those like numbers around.
Yeah, of course.
So obviously these numbers that we're saying aren't hard and fast. They're just an initial indication based on those data, right? I needed to get that out there.
Yeah, of course. And I think you always want to say that. And I think people, again, it's easy to sort of get caught up in the minutia of the numbers. I think what you want to take away from something like that 90% is just like, look, in Age of Sigmar, if you're way better, you're going to win more games, right? And it's like the stats back that up. You know, it might not be 90%. Maybe it's, you know, maybe if we had samples for every single game ever played, it would be 75%. It's probably not 30%. You know, you can say it's probably not 30%, but you don't want to get hung up on the exact details. And it's a similar thing. So one of the things I looked at was which factions are the factions that are more likely to win when they are being played by the weaker player. And sort of the top faction for that right now was Caradron Overlords, winning 27% of their games when they were the weaker player. And the second top faction was Ogre Moor Tribes, winning 25% of their games. And it's interesting because I haven't seen a single person mention the Ogre Moor Tribe stat. Everyone, you know, a lot of people talking about KO. Part of that is that, you know, they're a newish book and they're around now and they're someone's got to be the boogeyman. But you know, that's probably that's the difference of a handful of games that would have meant Ogre Moor Tribes was the 27% and KO was the 25%. So I think it's important, especially with Age of Sigmar or just wargaming in general, where your data set is much, much smaller than it would be for like a video game or an esport or something like that, that the little fluctuations in the number aren't, you know, they can be fun to look at. And they probably give you a good, you know, a rough guideline, but not to get too hung up on them. Basically.
So just for some clarity in the chat, and big shout out to Seb, hope he's well. The week of player is defined how?
Yeah, so basically I create an ELO for each player. So everybody in my data set, which is, I think the total data set is about 8,000 games. Each player starts out at 2,000 rating. And then I track every game they play versus another player that I've got recorded with, and whether they win or lose, and their rating will go up or down depending on the skill of the other player, the elo of the other player that they beat. So you start out at 2,000, you know, you beat someone, you go up to 2,100. That at the beginning it's sort of all a bit in flux, and then over time it stabilizes and says, okay, look, well, if you're an 1,800 rated player and you lose to a 2,700 rated player, that doesn't count as much as that doesn't affect your rating very much as it would when you play, you know, on game 5, you play against someone who's 1,850 rated. And it's like, okay, well, you know, then you can get a good read on like, okay, you probably are, you know, worse than this 1,850 rated player or something like that. And again, it doesn't take into account your list, you know, which, as you say, is partially a player skill, but also when you get to the table, you know, maybe you chose for some reason to play a weaker list and that won't be reflected. So again, all with a pinch of salt. But yeah, so I take basically over that data set, I get the player elo, and then I use that to compare the players. So I'll, you know, what it means when a better player with a better faction is winning is that there's some 2,700 rated player playing, you know, Disciples of Tzeentch, who are a 2,500 rated faction versus, you know, a 2,400 rated player playing Caradron Overlords, who are a 2,800 rated faction. And she's like, okay, the better player has a worse faction. Doesn't mean a bad faction, you know. It just means slightly less, and they're still winning.
Yes.
So yeah, and I think again, yeah.
I think one of the big conversation points, which again isn't in those data sets yet, and I know there's still more to talk about. One of the things I really enjoyed about the weekend, for instance, for the Super Series, and one of the things that I think I would like to see more of is two armies identical playing a different battle plan, or just having the experience of having played the other person, that knowledge of how the other player plays or how their army plays, like is a fractional difference again. Like, you know, it's just that very minute difference, and you think, okay, because in again like League or Magic or a Go even, like there's so many reps you can get in to develop those skills. Like, you know, deployment sometimes can take 20-30 minutes, you know, for setting up a game, let alone actually like doing the moves. So there's reps, so you really do learn quite slowly in wargaming.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, in fact, I'm going to sort of split up what you said a little bit. I think you actually learn super fast or not at all. So basically, I think you come up to a game and you're like, okay, I'm playing against Caradron Overlords as Disciples of Tzeentch on Better Part of Valor. What are the chances you've ever played that before? Probably almost zero, right? You probably never played that matchup before. And so after you've played it once, you're probably like, you've actually probably learned like a big jump in learning, but when are you going to use that knowledge? You know, you're probably not going to play it again. So you sort of learn in this very sparse way of being like, as you say, in League of Legends or Magic or Hearthstone, you're like, okay, I've played this matchup 100 times. so I know how it works, and now I'm going to try and play it well. In wargaming, you're like, I've literally never played this matchup. And as you say, if you said to someone, okay, you're going to play this Zinch versus KO on Better Part of Valor 10 times in a row, I think you get a very different result from the huge amount of variance you'd get in the first game. In the first game, I think, and I've played games like this in practice where you play it out and you're like, both players are like, yeah, I really don't see how you could ever win that game. They're like, it looks to me like this happens, and you're just always going to struggle. And then you look at it for like a little bit more, or you re-rack and play it again, and then you're like, oh, actually, now I think it's the other. Now if you make these couple changes, I think it's the other way. I don't know how I could ever win. And so I think as like you the sort of amount of possible games you can play in terms of matchups versus armies, players, and battle plans is so big that you cover that ground very, very slowly. But the flip side is if you can get practice games in of army matchups or battle plan matchups, you get a lot of bang for your buck very quickly. If you I played this matchup once before, you're actually way ahead of the field.
Yeah. Which is my point, right? Play games as often
exactly,
as possible. Yeah. And it's something that can't really be understated. Which is I like that. Like when someone years ago suggested to me, it's like, I'd like to see tournaments where I see the same players potentially play each other again at least. I was like, actually, that's fascinating. Like, how would they do? Best of 3? Like, is it that one dice roll? Like, for example, Andy's game at the weekend with his big block of Bloodtooth Ard Boys. Like, it's just a 4-up.
Yeah.
They all die.
Yeah.
On a 4-up, they all come back. And really,
uh-huh.
that's super hard to put into data sets. Oh, Ben, thanks for joining Patreon, baby. Yeah. All right. Big love to you. That's nice. I'm sorry to disturb you there, JP. It's just it's a nice thing. Another question, not that there isn't more to talk about, but you've had a question, so I'll ask. Do you think tabletop games like Warhammer, which relies heavily on chance and has a big hobbyist component, should be a competitive game? I mean, I could answer that for you, but I'll let you answer.
So, I mean, I think it depends on exactly what you mean by your answer of competitive. But yes, I think is the short answer, right? I think a good thing about Warhammer is that it's sort of relatively easy to split and have you can have your cake and eat it in terms of having competitive games coexisting with like the more narrative games. I think it does definitely feed into the fact that when you look at these stats and stuff like that, you shouldn't take them too seriously for exactly that reason. You're like, people aren't bringing the army that they think is the most likely to win, because otherwise everyone would only be playing one faction. People are like, even competitive players are like, these are the models that I wanted, right? I wanted these models, and so I made a competitive list out of them. Maybe they're only selecting from the top 5 factions, but still, that happens. So again, you shouldn't get tied up in the idea that these stats are the same as stats would be from a super competitive game. If you look at, stats from the NBA, those are all people who are really, really trying hard to do nothing but win. And so in Warhammer, I think, again, you should just keep it in mind that the Warhammer sort of tournament scene across, whatever, is not super competitive compared to the NBA or esports or anything like that. So it's like, I think T-Sports and the Super Series and stuff like that is awesome, and that is sort of a more like purely competitive format. But the way that Warhammer is mainly played is not in the super most competitive.
No, it's not. It's not, like you said. Like the stats for some of those armies are just brought down because someone's like, "Lol." Oh no.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say it. Trogs. Don't get me, Trog. I'm so sorry, but or spiders. Someone's like, I mean, Gits aren't doing particularly well anyway. But like you can make your Slaves to Darkness army particularly bad by trading out your Bellicor for a Myrmidon destroyer. That guy, whatever he is that no one's ever seen. So you can just play worse because you want to play worse, which is a weird format.
Which doesn't happen in a lot of things. I also saw. I've realized I can open the
Please
Twitch
do.
chat as well. So I saw this. So Colonel Cabbage, blessed name, on Twitter. You said that some factions like Beasts of Chaos are missing due to a lack of recent data. How do you rank these factions? Yeah, so the way that works internally is those factions still have. So the elo that I use is made of two parts, basically. It's made of like a ranking and a confidence. So that confidence increases. It's a confidence of how good the ranking is, basically, and it increases the more games you play. So when a player or a faction has their first game, it'll be like they're 2,000 elo, but their confidence is very, very low because we've never seen them play. We have no idea. And so basically that gets used internally by the calculation. So if you beat an army that's 2,700 rated, but it's very low confidence because perhaps it's only played one game and it won it, then you won't get as many points as beating a 2,700 rated faction that is very confident because it's had enough. So I tend to only post the ones that have a high confidence rating. But internally, beating low confidence ratings gives you elos. You can still gain lose elo from beating those factions, but it's just less. You gain or lose less because that confidence rating is lower.
So my question for you is what volume of data do you think is required to get something that feels like it's plateaued out? Have you ran some like fake numbers?
You like the thing is, it actually takes a very small amount of data to get reliable answers. Okay. So and you can see what we're looking at now, which roughly looks like what people expect. It's the data isn't coming out and being like Nighthorn is the best faction in the game, and you're like, well, I guess I haven't played that many games. And in general, with stuff like this, if you say had 20 to 30 games for each faction, that's quite a lot, and you have a reasonably sturdy thing. What you don't capture is this sort of, there's a lot of hidden detail that doesn't make your data wrong, but you're missing out on seeing stuff. So like battle plans. So again, Warhammer events are made of a random selection of battle plans. So even though you don't know what those battle plans are, it sort of doesn't matter. You're like, KO are, these events, because, each event has 5 randomly selected or sometimes pre-selected, but has 5 battle plans that aren't always the same ones. You can still say KO are good in the current meta, like the current meta of the current tournament meta of picking 5 random battle plans. If, for example, Nighthorn are really, really good on one battle plan, we won't know it. That's the thing we're missing, and so I think you can say that the data we're getting now is reliable, but there's a lot of other stuff going on that will have an effect, and we don't necessarily know how big that effect is. So, for example, the thing with KO often winning, when I say often, 1 in 4, winning the games where it's the lower ranked player. One of the things I said on Twitter was, if you have a lot of people who've played KO since before the book, and when before the new book, KO were quite weak, so they might have, if they've only played KO, they might have a lower player elo. And then the new book comes out and they start beating people who are quote unquote higher elo, even though they were actually always more skilled than them. They just have always sort of been self-comping themselves by taking a weaker faction. And it's like, that could exist, and that could be part of the phenomenon. So I think, again, what it can be, you can look at these numbers and just try not to read too much into the reasons, and more just observe them as a sort of state of the game. So you're like, okay, KO and Seraphon are doing well at the moment. So if I go to a tournament, I can expect to see good players playing KO and Seraphon. I can expect that if I go into those games, I'm going to get a hard game and stuff like that. You shouldn't worry too much about being like, okay, I need to go buy a KO army because otherwise I'm not going to be able to compete, because that's not true. And we don't know entirely the reason that these numbers are exactly the way that they are.
There's also another defining spread which we often neglect in the representation of those armies. So yes, KO, let's say, par example, are excellent. Yeah, like let's say they're excellent, but actually their really tough matchup is the aforementioned Nighthorn, which we never see.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
but because Nighthorn aren't powerful, let's say, or just aren't popular because they look rubbish, I think they look great, but the point still stands. For whatever reason, you don't see as many of them. There isn't, all of the armies are not represented equally. There are always more of Army X than Army Y. I think back to 2018, and we had 11% of the meta was Legions of Nagash, and then 12% of the meta was a Stormcast. So 25% of the field was those two armies. So really, it doesn't give, because the game is a bit more rock, paper, scissors, so still that really pushes the numbers around as well. That's not to say, again, that I don't find all this stuff super fascinating, and I think that's the job of people like yourself who are able to create and generate such excellent math and present that to us, because it's brilliant, and you're like, oh wow, I'm just learning so much. But also there's the deeper dive where it's that, like you said with Go, there's that emotive feel that you have to kind of like interpret. A bit like when we do like when I do a Battletome or a Codex review, you kind of like, okay, this is pretty bonkers, lads. And you're like, no. Like, I remember having a conversation about the Flesh Eater Courts book, and I was like, this is mental. And they were like, it's actually really hard to achieve. I was like, no, it's not. You cast one spell, you add D3 attacks, and then you use a command point. And they're like, no, super hard to do. I was like, what? Like, have you not played the game? That's not hard to do. Like, you just do, you do one, you do two, you move forward. So sometimes there's a lot of feelings that go around those numbers as well, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and I think there's a good quote, I don't know who said it, but which is just that all models are wrong and some are useful. And it's a thing I like to go with stats again, is like, don't get too hung up again on like being in a WhatsApp group talking about whether this win rate really represents the state of the game, right? Like maybe KO is the best faction, as you say, because no one plays Nighthaunt, which counters it. And you live somewhere where the best player in your local scene plays Nighthaunt, and so KO can't never do well. And it's like that might be totally true. And in your meta, KO aren't a very strong faction. And it's like, cool, like good. Like that doesn't mean the stats are wrong or that you're wrong or that anyone's wrong. It's just you shouldn't get hung up on the stats for themselves, but only if they're useful for you. So if you're like, okay, I see KO are really good right now, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bring Deepkin because they're good against shooting. Cool. And then if that means that when you go to an event you win more because you play against KO, then good. The stats have been useful for you. So if the stats are wrong or they're wrong for you, it's like, cool, just throw them away. Like, you don't need them. They're wrong. Like, as we've discussed, there are a million different factors that go into it that can't be covered. So if they're wrong, they're wrong. Like, just ignore them. It's like, you don't need to get people. I think sometimes can forget that the stats are like a reflection, a not entirely accurate reflection of the state of the game.
No, but I think one of the things that you did, which is brilliant, was like the thing that I like that you've currently done between Daughters of Cain and Kharadron Overlords is the general player skill level is actually, there seems to be that the Kharadron Overlords is a good book if you are a good player, but the Daughters of Cain book is a good book. Doesn't matter really about your skill level. There's a certain level of like pilot. I think that's what they effectively said.
It's the other way around, but yes.
Oh, what the KO is? If you're not the best player, KO is still good.
So Daughters of Cain have over the year of the data set I have, they played 33 games where they were favored and they won every single one. So where the player was better. So the higher skill player playing Daughters of Cain won every single Daughters of Cain game and did not win a single game where they were the weaker player. Which, I mean, obviously the 0% is probably
if anyone would like to clip that and send that to Benjamin Sava so he could just toot his own horn for hours, please do.
And then Kharadron Overlords won 1 in 4 games basically where they were the weaker player, coming back from that.
Okay, all right. That's interesting to me because I would have thought it was the other way around, but that's really interesting because for me it feels like the Daughters of Cain armies just push and play, whereas the KO is a lot more knife edgy. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's
I think there was definitely a time in DOK's history where that was definitely more of the case, where it was just like everyone's playing combat armies and Daughters of Cain are the best one. I think now it's they've had a lot of nerfs and also just range damage, right? If you're losing your hags, your game gets harder, and they've had some points increases. Part of that also might be just because KO is newer. It's like you can beat better players because they haven't had as much practice against KO as other factions. I also think though that KO it's not point and click in terms of winning the game, but it is point and click in terms of doing what you want. So like every turn you can be like, all right, well, what I want to do is I want to move my models to here, which I can do, and I want to attack this target, which I can do because most of my stuff is shooting. Mm-hmm. Often having more choices though is also, as I'm sure lots of KO players will attest to, is sort of the rope to hang yourself with, where you're like, because I could move all my stuff 9 inches away into the back corner, I did, and I got punished. Whereas some armies are don't have as many decisions and are just going to sort of more accurately reflect what the book does. So like Flesh Eater Courts is an example now where you're like, you sometimes just don't have a lot of options aside from run up the middle of the table towards the shooting army and hope you don't die, and then and just go again. You're like, there isn't a lot of skill expression happening here, not because of how skillful I am or my opponent is, but just because of the way that these two armies happen to interact. Yeah. So having high skill expression isn't always going to mean that you have a high win rate when you play well.
No, but then I feel that then cycles back to army list choice, where
yes.
if you give yourself that, like, what seems to be less plug and play but more adaptability, which is harder to achieve, which is why I feel Seraphon is such a bonkers book, because it has all of the tactical options to get itself out of a problem or deal with something, both in unit selection but also application on the tabletop, and then also it's got the output to do the thing.
yeah.
It's also got that, so that works across there, I think. So is there anything else that we happen to see from all of this data? Obviously all of this data you can go and find on the link that I'll include below, which is specifically JP.
Well, I think you can either find it on my Twitter or you can find it at ageofsimulator.com/metabreakers, where I have most of the high level analysis and stuff that I do.
Yeah. Okay.
But the Twitter, JP Gannis, is everything I do gets posted there, and if there's an update to the website, it also gets posted on Twitter. So
perfect. Was there anything else that we've missed that we haven't covered yet?
No, I think we've looked at most of the stuff. Again, like I'm going to be doing some more stuff now that I've sort of got a new data set to look at, and hopefully be posting more cool things. Have branched out into this sort of picture infographic thing, so probably do more of those. And hopefully also
it's useful for the destruction players at least.
All the Gobapalooza abusers, that's who it's useful for.
I mean, Nathan's got most of his Gobapalooza painted now. I think it's like 83.2% done. I'll have to double check with him sometime soon. And he'll be very happy to hear that they're undercosted.
No, they're undercosted. They should be, according to Listbot, they should be 450 or something % more expensive.
Wow. I think Listbot's got some learning still to do.
Well, yeah, I don't think that's far enough if you want fair game for the players. So.
Yeah, I agree with you, absolutely. Okay, well, thank you so much for doing what you've done so far. Is there anything you'd like, any shout outs or anyone you'd like to big up for all of this process, or ask for any help in the future, anything like that?
I think I'll shout out the people who have to see like all the interim work, like all the charts that don't make it, all the stats where they're like, I don't know why anyone would care about this, and I think it's wrong. So shout out to my boys Nathan Watson, Craig Graham, Phil McGuinness, David Neri. Those are the main people who have to see all the roughshod work. I think at one time, and maybe I'll one day publish this, I did a thing where I made a 3D model of like a city where each building grew over time based on how that faction did in terms of their win rate. And yeah, so maybe one day that'll come out, but I showed it to all of them and they're like, what is this? Is terrible. So shout out
no, I like it. That sounds great.
Yeah, it does sound cool. It sounded cool. It definitely didn't look that cool, but maybe one day we'll bring it out anyways. We'll bust it out. But yeah, thanks to them for looking at loads of stuff that was just trash.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I do the same. I'm like, hey, what about this? And they're like, don't care. Not at all do we care. I'm like, okay. No, we did that. Like, I don't know if you saw some of the stats for the list reveal show for Super Series. I was like, some of the stuff that I would like to track in the future is number of drops, number of bodies, and number of units. Those are 3 data set points that I think would be fascinating to track armies generally. It's like, actually ignore factions and everything else.
Yeah.
Like number of drops, where does that sit in like the win rate? Number of bodies, where does that sit in the win rate? And then number of wounds, number of wounds, and then number of units. So there's 4.
Sure.
Sorry, 4. Because I think those are all actually really, really interesting when you look at it. Because if you look at the Bruce's list from the weekend, for example, they all sat between 117 and 135 wounds, but in the wounds cap. But bodies wise, it was like eels, so it was like 32 bodies or something, all the way up to like 140 bodies. So there was a big variance in like the actual like expression of the bodies on the board, but the actual wounds were the same. which I found really interesting.
Yeah, I think all those stats sound cool. Fuck the haters.
Yeah. I didn't know there was any, but yeah, now fuck those guys. I agree. All right, well, listen, it's been a pleasure. You're a hero. I can't wait to talk to you again in another 100 days. Maybe in 100 days, I won't even be talking to you. I'll be talking to Listbot directly.
Yeah, it'll just be a very obvious looped recording of me on the camera.
You become a VTuber. Just pretend to be Listbot. That's what I want. Or at least, I think you've got 100 days. You could build yourself a Cartman-style, awesome robot box out of tinfoil.
I think an adorable face would really help with Listbot's sort of public relations during the robot revolution. So
it would. Just very nicely. Yeah, no, I agree. All right, well, it's been a delight, and you're a hero. So thanks for coming on the show.
You too, buddy. Thank you very much.
And thank you to everyone who's joined us live. I hope you're having a great day. Look after yourselves and stay healthy and well. Don't forget to drink loads of water and stay hydrated. Thank you to everyone on the Honest Wargamer Patreon. You guys are wonderful. Tomorrow is day 183, which is exciting. But if you love 40k, you can listen to me, Nick, and Tom back in action tonight talking about, well, the fact that the game is still not ready. Still not ready. They've still got a whole new game to release with the new Marine book, so we'll talk about that later. Everyone have a great day, and we'll see you soon.